Hello, everyone. Welcome to this evidence-based mental health Google Hangout on today. Today we'll be discussing a recent paper in our journal, Heart Rate Variability in Bipolar Disorder and Borderline Personality Disorder Clinical Review by Oliver Carr, Martin DeVos, and Kate Saunders. We're joined today by two of the authors, Oliver Carr, who is a PhD student at the Institute of Biomedical Engineering at the University of Oxford in the UK, and Kate Saunders, who is a senior clinical researcher in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Oxford. Also, we're also joined by two discussants, Maria Faurholt-Jepsen, who's a postdoc researcher at the Psychiatric Center in Copenhagen, Denmark, whose research focus is on electronic monitoring using wearable devices and smartphones in bipolar disorder, and also by James Heathers, an applied physiologist at Northeastern University in the Computational Behavioral Science Lab. He's joining us from Boston. Oliver, why don't you get us started and give us a little background on the paper and what some of your findings were?
Yeah, good. So we were reviewing some recent papers that look at heart rate variability measures in both bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder. So heart rate variability looks at the variation between the beat-to-beat intervals of the heart, and the control of this is often linked to the autonomic nervous system. So different areas of this speed up or slow down the heart. And dysregulation of this may occur in these disorders and in the different mental states. So we were looking into how these have been reported and how these reports can be improved and standardized so they can become reproducible. Yeah.
And I suppose the reason we chose these two clinical groups is we have an interest in mood instability as a sort of transdiagnostic phenomenon. And one of the things we've been quite interested in is whether you find instability in physiological variables as well as in mood, and whether there's any relationship between the two of them. And these two clinical groups are, I suppose, both defined really by an overlapping phenotype of mood instability, and so they're actually quite useful to compare to one another because you can ask specific questions around mood instability and its specific relationship to other variables, whether that's diagnosis specific or in fact sort of transdiagnostically a phenomenon. So they seemed an interesting sort of set of diagnoses to compare, and they're ones that Oliver and I in some other work have been looking at other sort of heart rate variables prospectively using wearables in. So this was a very good basis really to begin to get an understanding of the literature that's out there already. I think the other reason to be interested in heart rate variability in these two groups is, of course, they both die on average about 10 years younger than someone who doesn't have a psychiatric disorder, and a lot of that's around cardiac causes. So we had quite an interest, there's also an additional sort of interest from a physical health perspective in heart rate variability in these groups. And we were, I guess, when we approached this, very fortunate that we had the graph checklist against which to perhaps have an objective measurement of quality of these studies, which enabled us to both to comment about the sort of clinical findings, but also, I suppose, as much of this paper is about what is and isn't mentioned methodologically in some of those previous papers. So that was the sort of rationale. I don't know if you want to say a bit more about the analysis of heart rate variability.
Yes, hasn't been very standardized how heart rate variability has been reported. So I guess the first problem is with the collection of the data. So in all these studies, the data is often collected in very different ways. So most commonly it's on a very short period, so 5 to 15 minutes in a controlled environment with a clinician. So they assume the participant to be at rest. And then there's often different stimuli that they're given, or different body positions to try and manipulate the heart rate variability. But I think more recently there's been development of mobile devices and devices which can record much longer term ECG signals, which allow more ambulatory monitoring and longer term recording of heart rate variability. But then it becomes very difficult with all the many different confounding factors, activity levels, the time of the day, drinking, eating, all affect heart rate variability. It becomes much more difficult to compare groups and do analysis. And also the actual processing of the ECG, I think hasn't been very well standardized. So it's very important to communicate how you've replaced missing beats or corrected for noisy data. And often these new devices, they output the heart rate variability measures without any raw data, and it's not entirely clear how all these devices do this. So I think it needs to be clear how these devices and reports state how they're calculating these measures in order to have more reproducible results.
So we ran a search through the usual sort of PubMed and things, looking for reports of heart rate variability in bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder, and then I suppose pulled out the relevant papers. And I think when we initially set out on this, thought we might have enough actually that we could do some sort of meta-analysis or actually compare and combine data. In fact, I suppose the first striking thing was actually that wasn't really feasible to do that. So in fact, what we've ended up doing is describing the different papers in a bit of detail, and it's quite interesting, really, the extent to which they differ in what they choose to report or indeed not report, given what we've already said about the complexity and the number of different factors that alter heart rate variability. And so it's in some ways a little bit difficult to draw sort of too many conclusions, because, for example, in bipolar disorder, it depends on the mood state somebody's in. Obviously, Maria's done some work looking at different mood states, so we know that probably is relevant to how you interpret the data. So there's also the question of medication, which isn't particularly well addressed, I think, in many of these studies, and we know that many medications alter your heart rate variability. Smoking, clearly a big kind of issue, particularly in this group who smoke more than perhaps are on average. And then there's things around comorbidity that don't often get reported either. All of them have been collected in a slightly different way, so you can't really say that you're comparing like with like. And then I think there's also a question about how healthy controls are defined, because I think, probably speaking from our own work, our healthy controls are rather a bit too healthy, probably don't represent what's normal or average, and probably are so different from one's clinical groups that in fact you don't really quite know what it is that the difference that you're perhaps picking up on. I think it would be fair to say, if we were to summarize the bipolar data, that it's probably that they have reduced heart rate variability would be a reasonable statement to make. When it came to the borderline personality group, in fact, the results were at times completely conflicting. We only found 4 papers that discussed that at all, and they came up with entirely contradictory and conflicting results. And I think, much as bipolar disorder is a heterogeneous disorder, I think borderline personality disorder is even more so, really, and none of them really reported things like mood instability or impulsivity or transdiagnostic or dimensional features that you might at least have been able to do some direct comparisons with. People, because of the way the diagnosis is made, you might have the label and look very, very different from the next person who has the label. So even at a clinical kind of level, very difficult to interpret this data. I don't know, Oliver, if you want to say a bit more about the methodological kind of concerns in terms of the way the things were reported against that checklist.
So there's a lot of the problems were with not describing the devices are used and their sampling frequencies, and a lot of the processing of the ECG and how it was corrected for abnormal beats, ectopic beats, and those kind of things. I think in general there are a lot of there were some common heart rate variability measures which are almost always calculated now, and they're quite well defined, although the interpretation of these isn't as well defined. And more recently there are lots of non-linear measures which are being developed, but which may give more information about the nonlinear dynamics of the heart, but they become become harder to interpret the clinical results.
So it sounds like part of there are two sides to this question. One is the question of what you're measuring and what the tools are that you're using to measure it, and the other is whether or not this in and of itself is a biomarker that has utility in understanding either the diagnosis or the longitudinal course and symptom management of people with bipolar disorder or other illnesses.
Absolutely, yeah.
Maria, did you have a comment that you wanted to make?
Yeah, well, first of all, I completely agree with that. We have some problems regarding the design of the studies, how they collect the data, how standardized the way data are collected, but also almost none of the studies that I know of have considered confounding factors in the statistical analysis. So really we don't know what it is that the results are telling us. In fact, are there differences between the groups, or are these differences due to other factors such as smoking, BMI, and physical activity and other issues? So I completely agree with Kate and Oliver.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, given that we know that those confounding factors are very important, that they are so missed out, actually, because in other studies, or studies of other things, they're often included, aren't they? Things like smoking status and meds, and yet actually they seem to have been largely ignored. And I don't know to what extent that's just to do with the feasibility of doing these studies and who you do them on. Are they, people who are inpatient and inevitably have to be on meds because they're unwell, but actually that allows them, they're sitting there. You can do this sort of work. I don't know, I guess, and I suppose the fact that technology has moved on perhaps opens up an opportunity now to do things in a slightly different way. I suppose the caveats that Oliver's mentioned.
But also, as you mentioned, Kate, the selection of the control group has a major impact, because what are the groups that you're comparing the patients with?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And actually, whether there's an argument to do similar to what you did, was actually you do a within individual or within subject comparison in different mood states may actually be more, or as informative at least, than comparing them with somebody completely different, because of the complex nature of the signal that one's looking at to begin with. In fact, maybe serial measurements at different points in time may actually be more informative than just the sort of standard controlled way of doing it.
Well, just for background for the audience, what do you think that heart rate variability would be representative of, for instance, in bipolar disorder? Well, so what is your concern about it, and how would it be used?
So I suppose it's thought to be a representative of emotional reactivity. That's one of the things that it may represent. It's certainly associated with things like social cognition and executive functions. So people have done studies exploring that. And we know that those are things that are impaired in bipolar disorder. And then I suppose there are areas of the brain that we pick up in mood disorder which are involved, which are thought to have a role in the regulation of heart rate. Which may be, I suppose, one hypothesis that gets put forward as to why these things are involved. And then I guess there's an interest because we know of the cardiovascular risk that these patients have that was never really truly explained. Even when you do control for smoking and meds, they still seem to be at higher risk. I guess heart rate variability may give us some insights into some of that.
And part of the difficulty in doing this is finding a standardized way to measure it. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. I think there are some standards. So I think the sort of linear methods are reasonably well described and used, but they may not actually be very helpful because of the complex nature of the system that you're looking at. That a non-linear approach may actually be more representative of that complexity.
But also across studies, what are the variables that you're reporting? Is it the amount of beats that are above a certain criteria, or is it raw data? I mean, what are reported in the different papers? That makes it very difficult to compare across studies.
Yeah, absolutely.
James, you have a comment.
Yeah, sure. This is, am I the only person who's doesn't work in mental health in this discussion, this cohort of people?
No.
Well, yeah, I'm an engineer, but I'm working with mental health data.
So close enough. This is well, I'll start by saying that if you propose a methodological checklist and people actually use it and take it seriously, then it's all tremendously heartening, because as a heart rate is a series of signal problems, as a methodology that can be deployed to make other observations is very simple to do in its own way. We used to say in the laboratory that I had at Sydney, I used to say we could train people to take data in 20 minutes. We could actually get the physical instantiation of getting data is extremely straightforward. And then I think I've spent probably 8 or 9 years now just on non-invasive physiology signals. And there's still many things that are entirely unclear. So trying to bridge the gap between what is an ideal collective practice of measurement and what actually happens in studies that people run is a really big issue. And if you study methodology, the fact that this has been taken seriously in the first place is an amazing step. This is I was very happy to find that you'd written a paper that centrally referred to guidelines that we had proposed, because they were a step in the right direction when it came to methodological control. Hell of a good start. The issue of reproducibility for something like this will only really be solved when you start to pull data, if you are making comparisons between subjects, because you raised an extremely good point previously when you said the easiest way to potentially make observations about someone, BD, BPD, when you have a data series over time within subjects between mood states, for instance, is probably a better target than trying to aggregate 30-something people at rest to 30-something allegedly healthy controls, however heterogeneous they might be. I agree with you completely, because that's generally how we do physiological measurement in the first place. That is, I mean, if we're doing a drug study or a tilt study, a lot of comparisons are within comparisons. We have a person at a baseline and then an intervention condition. And then we have a person at a baseline and then we have an intervention condition that is graded somehow. Either a dosage is increased or an angle is increased or a level of stress is increased. And they are, you essentially have a series of within-person comparisons to the individual baselines corresponding with each individual graded exposure. Now that's how that's the physiological sort of study perspective on what's the best way to run this, and that's exactly what you've just proposed. So if you can figure out a way to instrument that easily, that is not something that is going to ruin your life from a running an experiment perspective, which is always something that you need to consider, that would be an excellent paper. That would show up in my research news feeds. I would read that one straight away.
Kate, do you have a comment about that?
Well, it's great. I mean, it's a, I guess it's a challenge, isn't it, as to how we join these things together. I think on many levels, actually, because I think as clinicians we come at things with a particular way of thinking about how we go about things, and it's not all that common to be working across departments, perhaps in the way that we're beginning to do. And I think the more dialogue we can have about these things, the more likely, we are going to get closer to a better designed study, both from the signal perspective, but also from the clinical perspective, because I think the two are not always necessarily aligned, are they? What might be ideal from a physiology perspective may actually be quite tricky for us for us?
Oh yeah, look, when you propose a long laundry list of things that people should do, you always realize that reality is a hell of a drug when it comes to running experiments, and laboratory environments are extremely well controlled by comparison to the clinical perspective of we're going to try and get as much data as humanly possible, because we're not even sure if these observations are going to be adequately powered in the first place. And you have a heterogeneous mix of ages and medication states and exercise levels and whether or not someone is postprandial, et cetera, et cetera. I work with and for psychologists a lot, and part of my scientific soul dies a little every time when someone proposes a study, and I think we cannot sufficiently control the observations that we want to make. Now, there is, however, a happy medium in there somewhere, and the problem a lot of the time that you face is that the errors in individual things are pulling you in the wrong way. And I'll give you a specific example of this that is something that I've found in other people's work and quietly pointed out to them without wanting to be gratuitous about it. If you leave in ectopy in a series of heartbeats over time via a normal electrical conductive process, and occasionally, because hearts are creative and are full of redundant kind of backup mechanisms, sometimes they just beat themselves for fun and for a variety of reasons and different reasons that happen at different points along people's individual lifespans. It comes and goes with medication, but basically you end up with a regular series, and then a lot of the time a very short beat, and then a compensatory beat, and then a series of vascular changes that happen after that. Now, if that condition is more common in your experimental group being compared to a control group, then your immediate problem is, the vast majority of the time, when it comes to people who are impaired, we are expecting HIV to be lower in some context. Unfortunately, the fact that the condition exists in the first place means that your variability is significantly increased if you leave the ectopy in. Because you're going, everything's perfectly regular, one very short beat, one very long beat, and then a series of changes after that happen in a kind of wave. Now, those people who are expecting at a group level to have less variation are, by virtue of the fact that they are in the observational group to start with, have more intrinsic immediate variation like that. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned previously, Oliver, there's some devices don't show you access to the raw data, and I've used plenty of them, and my immediate perspective on that would be you should probably not use them. A lot of algorithms that are built to turn a heart rate series over time into individual beats do not do an amazing job. And that's not entirely their fault. They are expecting their input signal to be regular. And the moment the input signal isn't regular, they have to start making approximations. Now, you have no access to the nature of those approximations, and they're very hard to reverse engineer. So you get a series of beats that looks normal, and you have no way of verifying whether or not they're accurate. Now, you can compare your black box, I'm not going to tell you how I work device, to a clinical device, and you can do an individual study about how good one is versus the other. But it doesn't tell you about the nature of any individual data series. And the moment you have people whose cardiovascular status is somewhat unusual, that can get really interesting really fast. Interesting is bad in this context.
No, I understand. Maria, do you have a comment about that? Because I think it's clearly pertinent to figuring out whether or not this sort of data collection can be used in prime time, that is. In other words, whether or not we can actually have this have important clinical meaning in the set of patients that we're interested in looking at.
Yeah, I don't know if Kate, could you comment on that, and then I might be able to to add something? Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a real challenge, isn't it? Because the allure of the devices that we're probably all individually wearing or carrying to collect data sort of opens up, I think, a possibility, doesn't it, that we can get ecologically valid data that's passively collected, largely at least. That doesn't mean bringing patients into labs, which might allow us to know something about what really goes on day to day and enable much more efficient longitudinal data capture. And I think that message, as Apple and others have put that out loud and clear with their health kit and various other bits and pieces that they can do that. And yet there's I think, as been outlined, there's a huge compromise really in the validity then of that data, or the accuracy of it. And I suppose I'm interested as to whether there's a meeting in the middle where you can get something that's good enough. Okay, it's not lab stuff, but actually is good enough to enable you to collect that data routinely, and perhaps be using it in clinical practice in an informed way. I'm not saying it's a gold standard, but so you understand its limitations. But I think from a patient perspective, that's clearly, certainly as a clinician, that's clearly what we would love to try and achieve. I think one of my big concerns is that because you've got things being sold as wonderful, we know that they're not. One gets a mismatch and a lot of assumptions that then are really unhelpful, actually, because patients don't understand why I'm asking them to wear a really ugly ECG device that keeps them awake at night, because it actually gives me a raw signal rather than wearing a nice watch that shows them their emails and their GPS all the time and purports the same thing. So I think that it would be fantastic if we could find a middle ground that enabled us to get data that was good enough and yet be feasible in a clinical context.
Yeah. I mean, James, I'm wondering if you have a thought about that, because if you're collecting heart rate or heart data about how someone's heart is beating, and you're using it for a cardiac disorder to try to determine whether or not somebody needs treatment, the information that you get has to be much, I would guess, more precise and reliable than it is necessarily if you're looking at the longitudinal course of somebody's mood disorder. In other words, you would think that heart rate variability as impacted by somebody's mood state is a very different thing that you'd want to measure than if you're looking at somebody's heart rate and they have a potentially deadly arrhythmia about to creep up on them.
Yeah, they're completely different applications. Most Holter monitors, the continuous ongoing cardiac monitoring in the non-invasive electrocardiology sense, is done by a Holter monitor, which is something we've had for I keep forgetting what year it is, so I'm going to say 50 years. They used to work on tape. They worked extremely well. They did actually had a normal reel-to-reel recording. They're very, very old school. Some places, even in fully developed countries, still use those because they work fine. Your accuracy requirements for something like that are counterintuitively actually a lot lower than HRV. And the reason is, if you have a non-persistent, idiopathic, weird arrhythmia, all you're doing is you're trying to instrument someone for long enough to be able to observe examples of it. So when it happens, basically, you need to be there to capture it. And sometimes if you monitor someone for a day, 2 days, 3 days, etc., and you're looking for instances of fibrillation or something like that, algorithms do a reasonably good job, and there's many, many years of research on how to specifically do this task. Algorithms do a reasonably good job of how to find the one specific instance that goes for 20 seconds over 24 hours, where you can find the error. Now, in HRV, generally you don't do that at all. You have a much less pleasant task, which is splitting a 24-hour recording into 5-minute intervals, which then you have 24 times 12 for the entire time. But you now have several hundred individual measurement series over time. A lot of which will be dirty. There's absolutely no way to avoid that, because people have to shower, they have to exercise, they have to lie down and roll over and move my electrodes around and ruin my signal. All of these things that are normally activities of everyday life are completely unavoidable, especially because you want people to act as normally as possible. If you say you have a during exercise, it seems to provoke some kind of cardiovascular symptom. You don't say go home and sit on the couch and do absolutely nothing while we look into your soul with this monitor. You tell people to act as normally as possible. So your ability to the observational environments are actually looking for very, very different things. And if you get a report back from a Holter monitor study, the vast majority of the time, it will give you this wonderful panel where every beat that happened is displayed in very, very miniature profile, where you can review things hours at a time. And you are looking visually a lot of the time for morphological changes. And you say there at 3:14, something funny happened. Let's look at that thing specifically. It is the complete opposite of having to clean and sometimes resample and then calculate various metrics, of which, as everyone is aware, there are many. I tried counting them once. I got to about 115, and then I left it because it was there's an awful lot of ways of adding up. There's an awful lot of ways you can calculate variance, and some of them have no physiological basis whatsoever. This is the problem with nonlinear metrics now, is that we expect biological systems to have certain properties, and the properties come from mathematical models. We take the models and say, if something fit those criteria, we would observe the following series of changes. So we've come up with an algorithm to measure that, and then you compare that between groups. Now, it doesn't have a physiological justification. It has a justification that's built from a model, and the model is built itself from an additional model, which is mathematical understanding of how a system might work, given its kind of baseline parameters. So whenever I see a study that just reports nonlinear metrics, now I don't think there were any in your paper. I think the vast majority of these were reporting the normal basket of metrics, but they do exist. But whenever I see one, all I can think is, all right, so you didn't get a result with any of the ones people normally use. So right. now we're using fuzzy entropy. And I'm sure if I wrote to you, you could explain what fuzzy entropy is to me immediately.
Right. Exactly. Maria, you've actually written about comparing patients in different mood states and what happens to their heart rate variability. Can you comment about that a little bit with regards to what we've been discussing about sort of whatever perspective you have?
Yeah, because what we try to investigate is because most of the previous studies that has been published have included patients, well, from a bipolar disorder point of view, they have included patients during various affective states and then compared to healthy control individuals, and not comparing patients with bipolar disorder across states. So what we aimed to do was to include a group of patients during different affective states. So each patient was measured several times using this free living Active Heart device. So and I agree with James. We have, of course, measuring heart rate variability during free living conditions has several methodological issues, but I think it's interesting to measure the same population across states and not comparing to a super healthy control group, as Kate and Oliver also mentioned during that presentation. But I guess if we were to consider this heart rate variability as a biomarker or a marker of affective states, it would require that it changes across states and discriminate between the states in order to use it as a marker.
Totally agree.
You do.
So while we're here and it's on my mind, without wanting to overtalk, which I have a tendency to do, especially when I'm tired, there is one of the problems that we have that's at the center of this is a lot of the time we're interested in cardiac sympathetic status. We are very interested in that specifically because we know how well it is involved within collective stress cascades, as opposed to parasympathetic status, which is there's still measurement questions around, but is much more straightforward when it comes to heart rate variability. There are only ways of taking a normal heart rate series and turning that into a metric and saying this has some kind of sympathetic relevance that really don't work at all. And this is one of the problems of the gap between fundamental, I shouldn't call it basic, fundamental and applied research, is that there are a variety of different ways, actually. Obviously, the very, very popular one is the ratio between frequency powers. There are others, actually, that are built out of ECG morphology stuff, which are much less well known, but supposedly do the same thing. Now, the physiological justification for these has always been terrible. And I mean, they were published in the mid-90s, and objections that have never really been answered were immediately published straight after in the late 90s. And of course, all of those have been robustly ignored in applied research. And now there's 8,000 or 9,000 papers, the last time I checked, that explicitly say we wish to measure either sympathetic status or sympathovagal balance from heart rate over time. Now, the physiological justification for that has been, there's a paper in 2004, I think. I think that's probably, when it comes to sort of the direct physiological evidence of whether or not that does or doesn't work. I mean, it was a good idea to start with. The original observations were fine, but it just doesn't work. Basically, we can't measure what we want until physiology, signal analysis, and engineering people come up with new ways of turning the instantiation of what you want into a signal that you can measure. And there's candidates for that now. But the problem is that an awful lot of physiology, even in the area, has moved on. We study different things now. There's not a lot of primary research being done in this kind of space compared to what was previously possible. There's plenty in other applied areas. HRV is totally central to lots of areas of exercise science, for instance. Obviously in biological psychology, and there's an awful lot in medical science. There's an awful lot of really bad research in straight medical science because there's a million various conditions, and the moment someone can get 20 of them in a room, they want to write a paper about it. But the center of that problem is that we can't really measure what we'd really like to. What we'd really like. We have an analog measure of that where we hope that parasympathetic status is adequately represented by HRV, but also has its own internal regulatory relationship to sympathetic status. And it's always very, I mean, this is your paper presents a view of a literature that's quite muddied in a way. Outcomes go in a variety of different ways. Things are conducted according to a variety of different sort of methodological assumptions. The analysis pathways are different, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to see something that's really muddied, add in impedance cardiography and measures of cortisol and measures of salivary alpha amylase, which are all some measure of sympathetic status in some context. And if you start to roll them together, instead of one confusion, you have multiple overlapping, mutually contradictive.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, I think it's worth. I think this is. It's worth. I think it's worth discussing the muddiness here because what you presented, Oliver, is what it is. It's what is currently published, and there's a lot of variability amongst the amongst the papers and studies that you cited in terms of their methodology. And so the question is, what, for me, in part, is what direction should things go? Do we know enough now even about the measurement of HRV in bipolar disorder to state with any kind of definitiveness that what direction we should head?
I think one kind of future direction, maybe through the improvement and development of devices which can record ECG or raw data over long term. And then you can start to track how, when the state of people with bipolar disorder change their affective state, we can measure that through the heart rate variability. So we have a inter-participant measures rather than these between groups at different times. So I think the way the technology is developing will help us do that.
I think there's also something probably about us being more closely aligned with those that understand the physiology better, so that you acknowledge that it's not perfect, but actually you have something that's at least good enough, or you've at least thought through some of the limitations inherent in what you're doing and your device choice and your sampling frequency and how you clean the data and what you do with ectopics, and that's made explicit. So I mean, I think I'm sitting here thinking actually this conversation in and of itself is in fact very helpful in kind of, it's these sorts of things we should be doing more of, because I think we don't have that expertise in those of us working in sort of clinical applied areas. And yes, in fact, for what's just being said, you know, there might be an argument to say, well, what's the point of us doing it? Because actually these things are probably, they're so muddy, they may not have any meaning at all. And I think it would be a great shame to dismiss the opportunity. But I think we need to be thinking more carefully about how we go about what we do, in order to try and challenge that a little bit and have better consistency and I suppose a bit more methodological rigor around the things that we think we're measuring.
Yeah, so one thing is the measuring devices that we use, but also in the study designs, we need to be more rigorous in how we design studies, how we conduct the studies, how many people we include, both in all groups, and to include more patients with various conditions, because it's not certain that this has anything to do with bipolar disorder or personality disorder. Is this simply due to medication or other social demographic factors that are different in these populations than super healthy control people? So I think one thing is the device that we use, and we need to be certain that we are collecting the data that we aim to collect, but we also need to be very careful on how we design the studies and conduct the studies.
Right. Yeah, you can get an awful lot of play out of improving your experimental design, and also in open data when it comes to patient ECGs that are so difficult to get sometimes. And so you run into this, methodologists run into this all the time. You say, well, your design should be adequately powered. And you say, well, I live in a town of 80,000 people. I'm not sure where you expect me to get more people who are on the upper end of this particular scale. Is that what you're saying is go away and do a different experiment? And I have access to what I have access to. And your ability to make an observation that can stand on its own feet, that has its own internal methodological justification, is sometimes at odds with your ability to do your job at all. So better experimental design certainly is a fantastic thing to think about. My favorite example of this is, you can read this from a physiological perspective. This is one of those things where you laugh a bit and then occasionally fall off your chair. There are plenty of studies full of patient groups of people who are taking real, legitimate, actual amphetamines. It is a normal medication in a lot of different conditions. And they are taking their HRV and mixing it in with everyone else's and reporting that some of the people took medication, and then not either attempting to control for it, saying how many people there were, or potentially excluding them because they are taking amphetamines. It is very obviously going to affect your signal. But it is not even challenging to find a paper where that is not dealt with at all. And that's
Right.
really like if you've actually studied them close up, the idea that you could be giving them to a non-zero amount of participants and not reporting it is kind of, wow. Well, I hope that works out for you, but I'm not going to read the paper anymore because I don't think whatever comes out at the end of this is going to justify me continuing to point my eyes at it.
Right. Maria, I'm particularly interested not just in the differences between, for instance, control groups and people with mental illness in terms of the biomarker like HRV, but also like the within participant variability over time depending on their mood state. And it's less important than that the control patient differences. Comparison is not as important if you're looking at within subject changes over time. Is there anything about HRV right now in bipolar disorder, for example, that would make it a useful marker of changes in psychiatric status over time?
Well, from my point of view, no, not at the moment. There simply hasn't been conducted any studies that are good enough in order to say anything about that. And also, I think some of these issues that we discussed regarding comparing patients with controls also apply when comparing between states, because patients, they change medication across states. So you need to take care of this in your analysis, because otherwise you don't have any idea of what it is that are confounding or biasing your results. So, but at the moment, not that I know of, have any studies have found anything useful.
Go ahead, Kate.
I think the other thing just related to that is actually I think we know a bit about what medications do in healthy people, but I'm not sure we know a great deal about the impact on heart rate variability of our medications in psychiatric patients. So there's an assumption that physiology will respond in the same way as you might if it was somebody who doesn't have the disorder. That's actually a presumption, isn't it? So it's kind of interesting to think through. Actually, we think we know what these medications are doing, but of course the underlying physiology may be different, and therefore the impact of medication on heart rate variability could actually be different, couldn't it, in bipolar disorder versus somebody with a different disorder. In the same way,
also, even though that you measure the same patient across or over time, across different affective states, the medication may change, the physical activity levels may change, weight, alcohol consumption, smoking, many factors could change across states over time.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think the future is for heart rate variability, even from a research perspective? Maria.
Well, I think it's a very interesting area of research, and I think we should continue the work, and we should continue to explore how to measure this in the best possible way, and to conduct studies in best possible way, and to investigate whether in fact this has something to do with bipolar disorder or whatever kind of disorder we are investigating, or if this simply has to do due to other factors associated with being mentally ill. So, but I think it's an important area of research, and I know that from our side, we will continue the work, and we will continue to investigate changes in heart rate variability in bipolar disorder.
Kate, your thoughts?
I mean, I agree. It's something we continue to do as well. I think there are lots of unknowns, but I don't think we know enough to know whether it is something that is going to be very valuable or not, and it would be a great shame to dismiss it just on the basis of the current existing evidence base, because I don't think there's enough there to really know for certain one way or the other than studies aren't conducted all that well. So I think it's really important to sort of build on the checklist and actually making sure that you've got more rigor around the way studies are conducted, so at least we can start to compare things and to be talking the same language. I think the other thing I'm quite interested in is actually whether we should be pooling data so that you can start to power things, because I guess an ECG is a fairly standard signal in some respects. I mean, all the other things with caveats aside, and in fact that might allow you to answer some of these questions without having to run massive studies, that actually one pulls data that's comparable and can run analyses where you might even be powered enough to do some subgroup things around meds and other sociodemographic variables. I'm probably just being a bit optimistic here, but I think it would be nice to aim to think one could do that.
I think it's important to be optimistic, Kate.
Thank you.
Before, which is, how are you going to get an adequate number of subjects involved if you come from a town of 80,000 people? I mean, I think that's really part of the biggest issue here is sample size, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, it is if you want to make between subject comparisons, yeah. Anything that has a low base rate, and an uncertain effect is very difficult to a priori power. So you want to say in the first instance, like we have an expectation of difference. We have a mechanism that we understand. We have an effect size that is drawn from previous studies. Hard to ascertain, but you will almost invariably come up with an answer that says get more people, right. unless you change the way that you actually model how the observations are made. We're at the stage now. You can now buy a 13-gram ECG that will happily attach for 2 or 3 days for about 400 or 500 euros. There are probably 3, 4, 5 builds that would be perfectly adequate to follow someone through disease progression or through modification of medication levels or something similar. But the kind of normalizing power of the get a group of people and compare them to a separate group of people who do not have the condition of interest kind of mentality is sort of it's kind of all encompassing. It's perfectly possible to do if you've got someone who is sufficiently unusual. It is perfectly possible to do research on a single person. You just need an awful lot of observations. You're just not going to explain any population variance. You're just going to be able to say that if you take as many measurements as necessary to power internal observations. I saw a case study a while ago. I couldn't tell you where it was. It was a single observation from one data point as an animal or a person. I wish I had more details for you, but it was for 300 days. Now, if you're taking 300 days worth of data for an individual person, you're allowed to use relatively basic parametric statistics, because if you start breaking the day into subunits, you have 600, 900, 1,200 internal points of comparison. It's just a matter of which type of variance you're trying to explain. You can say an awful lot about that person and you hope they generalize, rather than trying to capture populations that are representative of the broader population and make inferences about what these definitional things consist of. I hope that made sense. I am very tired.
That's fine. Kate, Oliver, do you want to sort of wrap this up together and make some final comments before we complete?
Yeah, I think it's just going back to the checklist and making sure it's always stated how these things are calculated. Yeah, I think the development of the technology is allowing people to get these measures more readily without really understanding them. So just ensuring that we're starting from the raw signals and how we're calculating these measures, and we're understanding their physiological interpretations and how these are reported is one of the main areas which needs to be improved.
Yeah, I think related to that, there's probably a need for a clinical checklist as much as there is the sort of heart rate variability things. Actually, these sorts of studies, what clinical information do we view as being a standard set of things that ought to be included? Something that's often not. And that's not just true of heart rate variability, that's true of lots of studies, isn't it? But I think that's important. I suppose my other kind of summary point would be, just because we didn't find much here doesn't mean there isn't much there to be found. It just means actually that unfortunately the methodology has sort of prevents us really knowing whether there is an answer or not. But that shouldn't be a reason for us to give up on this as a potentially very interesting biomarker.
And also just to emphasize that in this area of research, we need to collaborate between areas of expertise in order to capture all the important aspects of this.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Yeah, exactly. I want to thank Oliver Carr and Kate Saunders from Oxford for presenting their paper, Heart Rate Variability in Bipolar Disorder and Borderline Personality Disorder, Clinical Review. We're really very thankful for having Maria Faurholt-Jepsen from Copenhagen and James Heathers, who joined us from Northeastern University in Boston, for their excellent participation today. I'm Michael Ostacher from Stanford University. I'd like to thank you and editors from Evidence-Based Mental Health for joining us on this Hangout. You can find this archived on YouTube and follow us at our Twitter feed at EB Mental Health. We will be posting future Hangouts through our social media accounts and on our website. I want to thank you. Take care.